One of my earliest memories is watching my friend get run over by a car full of gang members, leading the police on a high-speed chase through the neighborhood. I was 3, and so was he. I grew up in the Northview Heights public housing project in Pittsburgh, PA, which meant 18 years of poverty, violence, and survival. While I was writing my memoir, it's out now, I Googled the names of the kids that I grew up with, well, some of them. These are the guys that I rode bikes with, played video games with, and hung out with after school. And most of those guys are either dead or serving decades in federal prison. But I'm not. And in this video, I'm going to explain the forces in the ghetto that led them to their fate, how I managed to resist them, and what we can learn from me. But before we get into that, I just want to let you know that I dropped the citations for every stat that I mentioned in this video in the comment. If you doubt anything, you can check the sources for yourself right down in the description. Now, every day in Northview Heights was a reminder that the future wasn't guaranteed. Gunshots at night were the soundtrack of life. Police sirens were background noise. There were good, hardworking people there, but they were few and far in between, and they got swallowed up by the environment and spit back out alive. Now, I'm the first person to say that you are responsible for your own life, the decisions you make, and I lean more towards punitive than rehabilitative justice. With that said, I'm 40 years old, and that's old enough to see people who were born when you were an adult grow up to be a person that ruins their life before they're old enough to have a chance to deal with the damage of how they grew up. I have a cousin who did 33 years for murder. At 17 years old, he killed a man over a taxi fare. 3 decades later, his younger brother, who wasn't even born when that happened, caught his own murder and distribution charges. The commonality is that they were raised by the same person in the same environment. In families like mine, tragedy isn't inherited, it's recycled. When I looked up the guys who I grew up with, I realized my cousin's story wasn't an exception. It was closer to a rule. Out of the dozens of kids I know or knew, only a handful made it out. The rest have been killed, incarcerated, or are still stuck living in the same housing project, some living with their mothers, some with children of their own, repeating the same cycle. But that pattern doesn't happen because these people are lazy or evil. It happens because their environment becomes the template for how they see life. Now, the hood doesn't just trap people financially. It also rewires your sense of what's normal. When you grow up where violence, drugs, and broken homes are the default, it shapes you long before you have the chance to choose who you want to be. You learn early that survival matters more than morality. The fast money is the only kind of money. Men don't plan for the future because they don't have one. The idea of stability or long-term vision feels like a far-off fantasy world when you've never seen anyone live it. And even today, look, having been out of that environment for over 2 decades, I still struggle with thinking long-term about money and financial decisions. And I know that's because I grew up in a house where my mom crashed out when my sister talked to her about a lesson in saving money that she picked up from school that day. This is the same mom I watched who always had money for beer and cigarettes, but always acted shocked whenever there was an eviction notice on the door. Now, she probably thought things were hopeless, so she just lived for the moment. I picked up that same mindset because that was the model I absorbed, and I fight against it every single day. I got another cousin. He's serving 20 years for distributing fentanyl. His father, my uncle, was an addict who overdosed on the same drug. Now, that's not a coincidence. That's modeling. He didn't just inherit genetics. He inherited an example to live by. That's how behavior passes from one generation to the next. You watch, you copy, you internalize. Nobody sits you down to explain right or wrong. You learn by what you see working. And what usually works in a place like that is destructive. Now, you really only give your kids 2 things, their genes and their zip code. You live where you live because of your choices, habits, and priorities. If those are messed up, your kids pay the price in an environment that overrides both nature and nurture. You become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time around. That's not just a motivational quote, it's behavioral science. Psychologists call it behavior contagion. When you put troubled kids together, the bad habits don't cancel out, they multiply. They compete over who can be wilder, laugh at breaking the rules, and treat rebellion as a type of social currency. If you want to be a good kid and learn, it's hard because that behavior gets punished by your peers, either through taunts, rejection, or outright physical bullying. So the disruptive behavior becomes like a virus, and soon even the quiet ones get infected because belonging feels safer than being different. Researchers call this deviancy training, and adolescent boys are especially vulnerable to it. There's also something called norm transmission, the invisible way a group decides what's acceptable. You don't need anyone to spell it out for you. You just absorb it. If everyone around you skips schools, hustles, is violent, or carries a weapon, not only do you become numb to it, you start to expect it. There was a period of my life where every day I walked home from school, I expected someone to jump me or to try and start something. Saying while falling asleep. You get so used to hearing gunshots every night that you forget it usually meant someone's death, and you could have caught a stray if you were out there at the same time. But norm transmission is even more powerful in smaller groups. When you're surrounded by delinquency, doing the right thing feels like a rebellion because it violates the unspoken group code that dictates acceptance and camaraderie or rejection and assault. And when the wrong things are rewarded, those become the guiding values of the community. Sociologists at the University of Chicago's Crime Lab mapped the social networks of thousands of young men and found something depressingly amazing. 70% of all the shootings in the city happened within a network that only made up 6% of the population. Violence doesn't spread evenly, it travels through relationships. In experiments that have been replicated in Philadelphia, Chicago, and Scottsdale, the biggest predictor of getting shot wasn't your income, your race, or even the neighborhood. It was how close you were to someone who had already been shot or arrested. The closer you were to violence, the higher your odds of becoming part of it. That's how norm transition works in real life. When you're surrounded by people who've been locked up, killed, or caught hustling, it resets your baseline for success. Just not getting beat up, robbed, or shot is a successful day. And when your baseline for success is that low, even winning can look a lot like losing. By itself, poverty doesn't cause people to break the law. There's no magic income line where a person earning below it decides to commit murder or armed robbery. But poor people commit violent crimes more often because poverty increases the likelihood of every condition that makes violence more likely, namely stress, addiction, unstable families, and general hopelessness and malaise. To better understand why urban poverty is so destructive, we have to contrast it with rural poverty. In the countryside, the same poverty that's in an urban center spreads out across miles. It's quieter, less dense, more private, but it still breeds its own kind of crime and violence. In particular, domestic disputes, drug overdoses, and self-deletion, way more common in rural poverty. But there are rural American communities where the murder and armed robbery rates rival those of any inner city public housing project. Most notably, the Appalachian communities in rural Kentucky and West Virginia, and many towns in the Ozarks region of the country, which are per capita more dangerous than any ghetto in any city. Rural poverty also has another unique advantage, if you want to call it that. And we'll get to it in a bit, but first, there's something else that I have to address while we're on this topic, and it's a slight digression. And because this always gets brought up in violent crime discussions, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that those rural areas are 90% white. No race is immune to the desperation of poverty, but the fact that most poor black people live in the projects rather than the trailer park has created a persistent illusion that there is something inherently violent about black people that racists like to use. In public housing projects, those pressures are stacked on top of one another. You got a few thousand people packed into a few blocks. The violence there becomes contagious, self-reinforcing, and a lot of men either become dispensers of death directly with violence or indirectly with drugs, or recipients of it as addicts or rivals for a turf to sell drugs on. While it's reinforcing your environment, it actually starts at home. Psychologist Albert Bandura called it social learning. Kids don't copy what their parents say, they copy what their parents do. This is another major leg up that rural poverty has on urban poverty. In rural poverty, even when people are poor, they're more likely to live in two-parent homes. That matters. A stable household doesn't erase hardships, but it gives structure, a built-in system of accountability and protection. In the countryside, poverty might take your money, but it doesn't always take your order. Mom and dad are often still together, and even if they're arguing or struggling to make ends meet, the kids see two adults trying to cooperate. that model stability, responsibility, and delayed gratification, skills that help you climb out of poverty. Urban poverty is a different animal. In the projects, the collapse of the family overlaps with every other form of collapse: joblessness, addiction, over-policing, and hopelessness. When most homes are run by a single parent and most of the men around are unemployed or incarcerated, the neighborhood loses its internal feedback system. There's no one left to model consistent discipline or long-term thinking. That vacuum gets filled by peers. And peers, especially young men, those adolescent men we talked about, don't teach patience. They teach impulse. So instead of one household showing a child how to weather a storm, the whole neighborhood becomes a storm of one's own making. Part of the reason for this breakdown, or rather why this breakdown hits cities harder than rural areas, goes back to policy. For decades, the government actually disincentivized marriage and father presence in low-income urban homes. Under the Aid to Families and Dependent Children, AFDC program, the main welfare system from 1935 to 1996, families could only receive benefits if there were no able-bodied men in the house. Social workers literally inspected homes for male clothing, boots, and shaving kits. If they found any sign of all that a man lived there, the family could lose its check and support. It was an incentive structure built on absence. If a man stayed, the family starved. If he left, the family ate. So in neighborhoods already crushed by unemployment and racial discrimination, fatherlessness stopped being an exception and started to become a survival strategy. That didn't happen as much in rural areas where there was less dependence on welfare and more opportunity for informal work. But in the cities, the entire housing projects relied on AFDC. The man in the house rule turned broken homes into a generational norm. That's why it's easier statistically and psychologically to escape rural poverty than urban poverty. In the countryside, even if you're broke, you still learn order, restraint, consistency from your parents. In the city, when every house on the block is missing a father, the chaos becomes the curriculum. Poverty is survivable. Poverty plus density becomes a broken family's worst nightmare. Now, if a mother handles stress with violence or alcohol, her son learns what strength looks like. There's no father around. If she lashes out from exhaustion, the child learns how adults cope with life. This is how behaviors like anger addiction or emotional avoidance get passed down without a word ever being spoken. You don't have to teach a kid to be angry, he just absorbs it. One of the most frustrating things growing up for me was hearing my mom say, "Do as I say, not as I do." It's a way for dysfunctional adults to not meet the burden of setting a good example for their children. My mom wasn't the only one who said something like this to her kids, and the reaction was always predictable. Whenever my sister and I would do something dumb, like try to sell fake drugs at school or get caught stealing from the supermarket, yes, both of those happen, my mom would always say, "I raised you better than that." Of course, this is the same thing repeated around the hood by parents who don't realize that kids mimic more than obey. As an adult, my sister had a hard time holding down jobs and making progress in her life because she didn't know how to control her temper or how she spoke to people. She didn't make any real progress until my mother died because she and my mother had an incredibly toxic, codependent relationship. My sister acted just like my mother, and they always complained about each other, but I always reminded my mom that at the end of the day, she's the adult and is the product of how you raised her. I talked in depth about this cycle in my video detailing the problems I've had to work on being raised by a single mom. I've dropped a link to that video in the description. I've watched that cycle play out again and again in families and my family, and it's not genetic. It's environmental. It's not about DNA. It's about decisions, and you see this repeatedly. Now, growing up like this gives you PTSD. Because you live in a literal war zone. Gunshots and fights outside are part of it, but the real trauma starts inside the house. The technical term for this constant survival state is hypervigilance, and it can literally get you killed. When you're hypervigilant, disrespect feels like life or death because where you're from, it often is. You react before you think. Thinking slows you down, so you don't want to do that. And everyone around you is the same way, so you want to act faster than them. The numbers tell the same story I lived in my childhood. In the 1990s, the national homicide rate hovered between 6 and 1,000 per thousand. But in Pittsburgh, specifically in the projects, it was 16 to 20, triple the national average. Most of the arrests on the north side were for crack in the mid-90s, and by the end of the decade, heroin had taken over. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reported that nearly two-thirds of inmates grew up in households earning less than $25,000 a year. Only 14% came from families earning above $50,000. Those numbers explain why escaping that world is so rare. When you're poor, fatherless, and surrounded by others fighting the same losing battle, low morale, scarcity mentality, and crime spreads like wildfire. It's a traumatic experience, but you don't even realize it's trauma. That's just regular life. In my memoir, I mention how angry I got when I realized that dealing with crackheads and hearing gunshots every night wasn't normal. You start to think stability is something other people get to have, not you. When the only examples of making it are drug dealers or rappers, taking the long, slow paths out seems pointless. You'd rather risk everything for a little bit of freedom now than play a game you can't win. When I ran the numbers, I found that 87% of black men who grow up in the projects in these conditions will either get locked up, hooked on drugs, or end up with multiple baby mamas. Most hit all three, and I should have been part of that group. Statistically, I had no business making it out. So why did I? My school system had something called the gifted program. If your teacher thought you were exceptionally bright, they'd nominate you for a test. If you passed the test, you went to a different school one day a week with kids from across the city. From 1st to 8th grade, every Friday, I was out of school with kids chosen for their curiosity and creativity. Many came from two-parent homes in neighborhoods where the average household income was close to six figures. At this school, intelligence and creativity were socially rewarded, so that's the behavior everyone expressed. Completely different from my neighborhood school where fighting and bullying were rewarded. In my regular school, I was suspended 15 times for fighting. I even got arrested for fighting once, but the officer let me off with a warning. That one day a week at the Gifted Center mattered more than anyone realized, myself included. The trauma didn't vanish, the fights didn't stop overnight, and the damage didn't just disappear, but my perspective shifted. For the first time, I could imagine a future that didn't look like my past. That motivated me to apply to a high school as far away from my neighborhood as possible. Instead of going to the neighborhood high school where most kids from my project went, I went to Shinley High School clear across Pittsburgh. That's where I met kids from Squirrel Hill, a neighborhood where the median household income was $123,000 a year, 6 times what I grew up with. For the first time in my life, I met people who lived with both parents under one roof. Being around kids from stable homes changed everything. I saw what normal could look like. I saw what it did look like outside the projects. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The people I met weren't worried about getting jumped on the way home. There was no fighting, no bullying, no chaos. My new friends were worried about grades, dating, sports, and college. The problems weren't about survival, they were about direction. Being around them showed me what life could be. Now, I was still living in the same violent neighborhood with an abusive home life, but I was barely home at this point. I'd stay late after high school or late after school playing sports or working, then hang out with my new friends. Their families treated me like one of their own. If any one of my high school friends sees this, just know how much you changed my life. I got to see how stability looked and felt. The difference wasn't just financial, it was emotional, and it made a big difference in my life. In those areas, people respected each other. Fathers were around, there was order. For 4 years in high school, I got to be mostly a kid without worrying about my safety. Even though I go back to chaos every night, I started craving that peace more than acceptance from the guys in my neighborhood or my family. The gifted program was the spark, but high school was where I started really cooking with gas. The more time I spent around stable kids, the more my standards shifted. When your mind adjusts to a higher standard of normal, it's impossible to go back. In the 1990s, the government gave thousands of poor families vouchers to move out of the projects into safer neighborhoods. Economists tracked those families for decades. Now, the parents didn't start suddenly making more money, but their children's lives completely changed. Kids who grew up in safer, higher income neighborhoods were 30 to 40% more likely to finish school, go to college, and earn more as adults. They were less likely to become single parents, addicts, or get arrested. It wasn't income or intelligence that made the difference. The families were still making the same. It was getting a chance to live a different life without the constant stress. It was being around peers and adults who modeled different behaviors and how it rewired what normal looked like. See, in this area, in these projects, you're not just dealing with your own trauma from the ass kickings at home or at school, or on the journey in between. You're also dealing with your peers and neighbors' trauma too. I got bullied. I was poor. My uniforms were tattered and I didn't fit in with the sports crowd. Most kids weren't openly hostile. They just didn't see me as one of them. I had nothing in common with my classmates and most didn't like me enough to be my friend anyway. And I didn't want to be theirs. I was too busy looking forward to the gifted center. Looking back, I realized what was happening. My early experience with kids from completely different socioeconomic levels gave me a taste of peace. These interventions didn't cure me. The damage from birth to 14 was already done. I still struggle with addiction as an adult and sabotaged relationships and made decisions rooted in fear instead of confidence. For years into my adult life, I stayed poor. I failed out of high school and then out of community college. I couldn't dedicate myself to anything long enough to finish what I started because I'd never seen an example of consistency. I didn't have a model for delayed gratification or discipline. None of this changed until boxing forced me to confront myself. That's where I finally learned discipline and delayed gratification and how to finish what I started. Boxing gave me what the projects and even the gifted program couldn't. A structure that demanded accountability and rewarded growth with pain, the missing piece that tied everything together. If you're trying to break the cycle, whether you're from the projects or stuck in any kind of destructive pattern, here's what I learned. You can't think your way out. You need exposure to a different environment, even if it's just one day a week. You need to be around people who model the behavior you want to have. And you need to write a passage that forces you to confront yourself. If you want to learn more about the rites of passage and how they helped me become who I am, watch this video right here on the screen. And I'll see you in the next one.